The first Monday in October, it's less than 3 weeks away, and that is the day when the Supreme Court begins its new term. But they will begin their session under some mounting storm clouds. Now, the court's 3 female justices, they're the ones that are issuing some of the warnings. First, it was Elena Kagan, who, in a scathing dissent on a case decided in June, warned that the court was trashing its precedents. And in that particular case, reheard arguments after Brett Kavanaugh joined the court specifically so it could overturn that ruling. Then it was Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg who warned of a deeply divided court on major rulings that we got in June and of deep divisions on the cases to come beginning this October. And most recently, it was Justice Sonia Sotomayor. It was her time to complain in her dissent on a major asylum case. Sotomayor vented that the conservative majority is now doing, quote, extraordinary favors for the White House. And the court is planning to rule on some major issues this session, everything from abortion to guns to immigrations, LGBTQ rights, and more. And you can add to that any cases they get from the standoff between the Congress and this White House. This will be a consequential session. And that will happen with all eyes on Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The 86-year-old just survived another cancer scare, but should she leave the court for one reason or another, the fights over her replacement and the direction of the court will be seismic. For more, we turn to Amy Howe. Amy is a blogger who was previously an editor and reporter for Scotusblog. She's also taught about the Supreme Court at both Stanford and Harvard. Amy, thank you for joining us. I want to talk about what some of the big cases we should be paying attention to in the upcoming docket. But first, in a dissent that only Justice Ginsburg joined her in, Justice Sotomayor talked about what she viewed as a really troubling trend here, where the administration, if they don't like a ruling, goes directly to the Supreme Court. And contrary to, if not precedent, certainly a trend that had happened under previous administrations, they're allowing that fast tracking at a much higher level. That's not just imaginary, that's backed up with data, isn't it?
That's right. A law professor at the University of Texas Law School named Stephen Vladeck has compiled those statistics, and the Trump administration in the past 3 years has come to the Supreme Court at a rate that is really significantly higher, orders of magnitude higher than both the Obama administration and the George W. Bush administration. You know, there are 2 schools of thought on this, and there's really not a lot of gray area, and it's sort of a Rorschach test for how you view sort of what the Trump administration is doing. I think that, you know, a lot of people believe that, like Justice Sotomayor, that there's overreaching by the Trump administration in coming to the Supreme Court every time they lose in the lower courts. But I think supporters of the Trump administration would say, on the other hand, that the reason that the Trump administration is having to come to the Supreme Court so often is because of overreaching by the lower courts, issuing these injunctions that these orders that apply nationwide. So, you know, there's 2 schools of thought on it, certainly, and there's not a lot of sort of wiggle room in between.
That said, and I've heard both those arguments, Amy, there was a virtual 40-year, as it relates to immigration law in place, and the Trump administration upended that with basically a virtual ban on asylum seekers. So what they were moving for wasn't some unprecedented move by Congress that they want to re-examine of the courts. They were taking the somewhat unprecedented. And as I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, the argument that Justice Sotomayor and the other supporters of her is there's a reason why you go to the lower courts. There needs to be more broader discussion about this and more back and forth for transparency purposes before 9 people, or 5 people in this case, make a sweeping decision with huge implications.
Yeah, I mean, that's why the lower courts are there, and that's why, you know, in the Supreme Court, many of the Supreme Court's cases that they take are, in fact, to resolve these divisions among the lower courts, when 2 lower courts have reached different issues, different conclusions on the same topic. And one of the things that the Supreme Court justices will say is what's called percolation. We like to hear what the lower courts have to say before we weigh in. I mean, once they decide to weigh in, frequently they don't really so much care what the lower courts have to say, but that the idea that these issues are best ventilated before they get to the Supreme Court, certainly.
lest anyone be naive that the whole appointment process to the Supreme Court isn't obviously driven with politics in mind. I get that, but what was the reaction within circles that you travel, Amy, when the president tweeted to the Department of Justice needs to save Justice Kavanaugh, given the new revelations that came out by those two Times reporters, the idea that DOJ wasn't basically an impartial ref here, but they were the personal counsel of either the president or Kavanaugh. Again, I know that there's a curve everyone grades the president's tweets on, but nonetheless, my gosh.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sort of a law school 101 separation of powers. There's the executive branch and the judicial branch, and I'm not really sure, to be honest, what he was getting at.
Let's talk about the next session that the court's going to have, because there's some very important cases. Tell us the ones that stand out the most to you.
Sure. I mean, it's going to be a term we know already that's going to have a lot of high-profile cases, and the court's going to be issuing a lot of these opinions in the spring and summer of next year, right in the middle of the presidential election season. So it's going to give them even added significance, and I think going to remind people of the importance of the Supreme Court, no matter what side you're on. You know, the court returns to the bench in the first Monday in October, and the very next day on Tuesday in October, the Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in a trio of cases about whether or not federal employment discrimination laws protect LGBT employees. There's one set of cases involving two men who alleged that they were fired because they were gay, and then another case involving an employee at a funeral home who was fired after she was hired. When she was hired, she dressed and presented herself as a man. She was fired after she announced that she was going to come to work dressed as a woman and undergo gender reassignment surgery. So that's a huge case. And then in November, the Supreme Court's going to hear oral arguments in a challenge to the Trump administration's decision to end the program known as DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It was an Obama administration program that allowed young people who'd been brought here without documentation as children to apply for protection from deportation. And so if you applied and were approved, you could not only have approval to stay in the country without fear of being deported, but then it would open up other doors, like being able to get health insurance, work in the country legally, get your driver's license. The Trump administration announced in 2017 that it planned to end that program. The Supreme Court's going to take up gun rights for the first time in nearly a decade. It's on its schedule for December. And then in the winter, they could very well return again to the topic of abortion. So they're really going to be hitting almost all of the hot button topics in the upcoming term.
And obviously, we're closing in on being 1 year away from the general election. And a 5-4 court compared to a 6-3 court in terms of makeup, it's not just a single seat difference. It could be also seismic in terms of, the swing that Roberts is now. That might even change. For those like yourself who watch the court very closely, if Trump were to have another appointment between now and the end of at least this term that he has, that could also have huge implications going down the road as well. That's
right. I mean, you stop and think, if Justice Gorsuch had been a Justice Merrick Garland instead, if Justice Kennedy hadn't retired and were not replaced by a Justice Kavanaugh, we certainly wouldn't be talking about Chief Justice John Roberts as the swing vote. And if the President Donald Trump were to be reelected and one of the court's more liberal justices were to retire, and obviously the most obvious candidate would be Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's the oldest justice on the court, we wouldn't be talking about the Chief Justice as a swing vote. It would be a really seismic shift on the court.
Amy, I really appreciate a few minutes today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me.
And up next, stories we think you need to know, including the Democrat-on-Democrat fight for a Senate seat in Massachusetts, complete with a name everybody has heard before. And scandal for Canada's Justin Trudeau. Weeks before Election Day, old photos surface of Trudeau in blackface. Those stories and more after this.